The aliens' shock was palpable when they discovered their human captive passed out in his cell, as lifeless as a corpse. Brian Gray, an elite Terran Vanguard operative, had been a prisoner of the Suliban for weeks now. Subjected to relentless experiments by their lead scientist, Fornax, the human was at his breaking point. But to the Suliban, his kind was an utter enigma. Brian's capture had been a fluke during a vicious space battle near the fringes of Suliban territory. The alien race, despite their technological superiority, had never encountered humans before. Intrigued by this new species, they whisked Brian away to a maximum security prison on their homeworld for study. Fornax's methods were invasive and brutal. He sought to unravel the secrets of human biology and exploit any weaknesses. Brian endured scan after grueling scan, his body pushed to its limits, but he wouldn't break. Then one day, Brian's exhaustion caught up with him, and he fell into a deep sleep in his cell. When Fornax and the guards found him unresponsive, they panicked, having no concept of sleep among Suliban. Fornax was terrified his prized test subject had perished under his watch. Alarms shrieked through the complex as Fornax summoned the highest Suliban authorities to deal with the crisis. By the time they arrived, a groggy Brian was waking up, leaving the Suliban leaders astounded that the human had only been asleep. Fornax's scientific mind whirred. This strange human practice of sleeping was a vulnerability, one the Suliban could exploit. If all humans cycled into these comatose states periodically, they'd be defenseless against attack. An invasion plan started to take shape. But Brian was no fool. He'd seen the Suliban's shock at him sleeping and began to stage random sleep episodes, feigning disoriented awakenings. He needed to keep them guessing about human dormancy patterns. More than that, he had to get out of this hellhole and warn Earth of the impending Suliban invasion. The fate of humanity rested on Brian's shoulders. He knew if he failed, Earth could burn while its inhabitants slept, oblivious to the slaughter. The Suliban could not be allowed to turn humans' biological needs into a weapon. As he sat in his cell, mind racing, Brian swore he'd do whatever it took to escape and sound the alarm. He just prayed he wouldn't be too late. Brian knew he had to act fast. His captor's shock at his sleep gave him an idea. He could use their ignorance of human biology to his advantage. Over the next few days, Brian feigned sleep during the daytime hours, laying motionless on the hard cell floor. At night, he stayed alert, studying the patterns of the Suliban guards through the small window in his cell door. He noticed a consistent gap in their patrols, a brief window where the corridor outside remained empty. It was his chance. One night, when the guards were distracted by some commotion in another part of the prison, Brian made his move. Calling upon his enhanced strength, a result of the Terran Vanguard's genetic augmentations, he strained against his restraints. The metal cuffs bit into his wrists, but Brian gritted his teeth and pulled harder. With a muffled snap, the restraints gave way. Brian lunged for the cell door, just as a Suliban guard passed by. The alien had no time to react as Brian grabbed him, wrestling away his weapon and access key card. Brian dragged the unconscious Suliban into the cell, quickly donning his uniform. Heart pounding, Brian slipped out into the empty corridor. He spotted a control panel on the wall, his special forces training kicking in. Brian pried open the panel, revealing a tangle of alien circuitry. His fingers flew over the unfamiliar controls, searching for a way to disable the prison's power grid. Suddenly the lights flickered and died, plunging the complex into darkness. Shouts of confusion echoed through the halls as the Suliban reacted to the outage. Brian smiled grimly. The blackout was his cover. He raced through the shadowy corridors, guided by his memory of the prison layout. Brian made his way to the hangar level, where a row of small Suliban scout ships stood parked. He sprinted to the nearest one, using the stolen access key to open the hatch. Brian climbed into the cockpit, scanning the alien controls. The layout was different from the Earth ships he was used to, but the basic principles were the same. He powered up the engines, the scout ship humming to life. With a roar of thrusters, Brian launched the ship out of the hangar. Alarms blared behind him as the Suliban realized their captive had broken free. Brian punched the throttle, the scout ship streaking away from the prison complex and into the night sky. He knew he had to get a message to Earth, to warn them of the Suliban's invasion plans. Brian aimed the stolen ship towards the communications array he had spotted during his capture, the place from where he could send a transmission to human space. As he approached the array, Brian frowned at the scout ship's control panel. The power levels were lower than he'd hoped, and the alien technology was more complex than he'd anticipated. He'd have to move fast to complete his mission. Suddenly, proximity alerts lit up the cockpit. A squadron of Suliban fighters had appeared on the scanner, rapidly closing in on Brian's position. He swore under his breath, realizing the Suliban were not about to let him escape so easily. Laser fire streaked past the cockpit as the fighters opened up on his ship. Brian wrenched the controls, sending the scout into a diving roll. The stars spun dizzyingly outside the viewport as he pushed the craft to its limits, drawing upon every ounce of his combat flying experience. The Suliban ships were faster and more maneuverable, peppering Brian's scout with laser blasts. Warning lights flashed across the control panel as the hull integrity dropped precipitously. Brian knew his ship couldn't take much more of this punishment. Smoke filled the cockpit, acrid and choking. In that moment, Brian realized with cold clarity that he wouldn't be able to reach the communications array. His ship was too damaged, the Suliban forces too overwhelming, but maybe there was another way to strike a blow. Through the haze of smoke, Brian spotted a massive structure in the distance, the Suliban military headquarters, the nerve center of their war machine. In a flash of inspiration, Brian knew what he had to do. He gripped the controls tightly, ignoring the scream of overstressed engines. Brian angled the crippled scout ship towards the headquarters building, plotting a kamikaze run. If he could take out the heart of the Suliban military, it might just give Earth the chance it needed. The surface of Suliban Prime rushed up to meet him as Brian guided the dying ship downward. With mere seconds to spare, he reached for the ejection lever, knowing this was going to be close. Brian yanked hard, the canopy blowing away an instant before the scout craft plowed into the side of the Suliban headquarters. A massive fireball consumed the building, the force of the blast throwing Brian clear. He hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop amidst the rubble and debris. Sirens wailed in the distance as the Suliban reacted to the devastating attack. Bruised and bleeding, Brian staggered to his feet. He looked around at the destruction he had wrought, the fires and billowing smoke that marked the grave of the Suliban's command structure. He had bought Earth some time, but Brian knew the mission was just getting started. He had to find another way to contact human space, to complete his desperate warning. Behind enemy lines, on a hostile alien world, the odds were stacked against him. But Brian was a Terran vanguard, a warrior forged in the crucible of Earth's defense. He would not fail. Dr. Eliza Novak frowned at her computer screen, the light from the display casting her features in a pale glow. Around her, the other scientists of the Terran Defense Council's research division worked frantically, a palpable tension filling the air. "I'm telling you, these energy signatures are like nothing we've seen before," Dr. Novak said, pointing to a series of jagged waveforms on her screen. "They're coming from the direction of Suliban space." Her colleague, Dr. Silas Adebayo, leaned in for a closer look. "Could it be some kind of new weapon? A power source we've never encountered?" "I don't know," Dr. Novak admitted, a note of worry in her voice. "But whatever it is, it's massive, and it's getting closer." The two scientists exchanged a troubled glance, the implications clear. Something big was happening out there in the depths of space, something that had the potential to change everything. And they were only just beginning to unravel the mystery. Dr. Novak turned back to her screen, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she worked to decipher the alien energy readings. She had a sinking feeling that time was running out, that the fate of Earth itself might hang in the balance. They had to figure this out, and fast. As the scientists raced against the clock, Brian Gray fought for survival on the surface of Suliban Prime, his desperate mission the only thing standing between Earth and the looming alien threat. The pieces were in motion, the countdown to invasion ticking ever downward. The battle for Earth's future had begun. Brian's lungs burned as he sprinted through the shadows of Suliban Prime's industrial district. Sirens wailed in the distance, search parties combing the streets for the escaped human. He pressed himself against a cold metal wall, chest heaving as he caught his breath. Years of special forces training kicked in. Stay low, move fast, leave no trace. As dawn broke over the alien world, Brian realized the futility of trying to contact Earth directly. The Suliban would be monitoring all long-range communications. He needed a new plan. His eyes fell on a sleek Suliban cruiser docked in a nearby shipyard. A crazy idea formed. Hijack the ship and pilot it through the nearby wormhole. It was a long shot, but it might be humanity's only chance. Under cover of darkness, Brian crept towards the shipyard. 2 Suliban guards stood watch at the entrance. He couldn't risk killing them. It would only confirm humanity as a threat. Instead, Brian used his enhanced strength to quickly incapacitate the aliens with precise strikes to pressure points. They crumpled silently to the ground. Brian raced across the tarmac, ducking between vessels until he reached his target, a long-range cruiser capable of wormhole transit. He pried open an access panel, fingers flying over unfamiliar controls as he bypassed security and powered up the ship's systems. A familiar voice froze Brian in his tracks. "I knew you'd try something like this, human." He spun to see Fornax, the Suliban scientist who had tortured him for weeks, emerge from the shadows of the cockpit. The alien's eyes gleamed with malice. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for," Fornax hissed, "but your escape ends here." Brian barely had time to raise his arms before Fornax lunged at him. They grappled in the cramped confines of the bridge. Brian's human strength matched against Fornax's alien physiology. Fists and elbows flew as they struggled for control. Fornax slammed Brian against a control panel. Sparks erupted as systems shorted out. Brian gritted his teeth, feeling ribs crack under the Suliban's assault. But he wouldn't give up, not with Earth's fate on the line. With a surge of adrenaline, Brian broke Fornax's hold and delivered a devastating headbutt. The Suliban staggered back, dazed. Brian pressed his advantage, raining blows until Fornax collapsed unconscious. Panting, Brian surveyed the damage to the ship. Multiple systems were offline, engines sputtering. He faced an impossible choice: abandon the plan or risk flying this crippled ship into the wormhole. The wail of approaching sirens made the decision for him. Brian strapped himself in and fired up the cruiser's damaged warp drive. The ship lurched into the sky, trailing smoke and debris. As he approached the wormhole, proximity alarms screamed warnings. The turbulent maw of the anomaly yawned before him, crackling with unknown energies. Brian took a deep breath and plunged in. The cruiser bucked violently, tossed by gravitational forces beyond comprehension. Cosmic radiation flooded the cabin. Brian's vision swam, blood trickling from his ears and nose. His augmented body was pushed to the absolute limit. After what felt like an eternity of chaos, the cruiser burst from the other side of the wormhole. Unfamiliar stars greeted Brian's bleary eyes. He'd made it, but at what cost? Warning lights flashed across every console. The warp core was offline, life support failing. As the adrenaline faded, the full extent of Brian's injuries became apparent. Broken bones, internal bleeding, radiation poisoning. He didn't have long. As consciousness slipped away, Brian allowed himself a small smile. He'd escaped Suliban space. There was still hope for Earth. His final thoughts before the darkness took him were of home, and the slim chance that help might arrive before it was too late. The battered cruiser drifted silently through the void, its lone occupant clinging to life. Humanity's fate rested in the hands of this one wounded soldier, lost in the vastness of space. The battered Suliban cruiser drifted silently through the void, its lone occupant clinging to life. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the damaged vessel. The UES Odyssey, a sleek human exploration ship, loomed over the alien craft. On the Odyssey's bridge, Captain Miguel Ramirez leaned forward in his chair, brow furrowed. "Report," he barked. "Sir, scans show a single human life sign aboard," the sensor officer replied, disbelief evident in her voice. "It's faint, but stable. Ramirez's eyes widened. Bring that ship into the hangar now and get a medical team down there stat. The Odyssey's tractor beam latched onto the Suliban cruiser, gently guiding it into the cavernous hangar bay. As soon as the ship touched down, a swarm of personnel descended upon it. Technicians in hazard suits worked to cut through the twisted metal of the hull, while medics stood by with stretchers and emergency equipment. With a hiss of escaping atmosphere, the cruiser's hatch finally gave way. The rescue team surged forward, their helmet lights illuminating the darkened interior. They found Brian Gray strapped into the pilot's seat, unconscious and barely breathing. "We've got him," a medic shouted. "Male, mid-30s, multiple fractures, severe radiation exposure. Let's move." They carefully extricated Brian from the wreckage and rushed him to the medical bay. Dr. Elena Kovac, the Odyssey's chief medical officer, was already prepping for emergency surgery. "What the hell happened to this guy?" she muttered, assessing Brian's injuries as her team worked to stabilize him. "It's like he went 10 rounds with a black hole." While the medical team fought to save Brian's life, Captain Ramirez ordered a full investigation of the Suliban ship. Security teams combed through the vessel, cataloging every bit of alien technology they could find. "Captain, you need to see this," Lieutenant Commander Chen, head of security, called over the comm. "We've got a prisoner in the brig." Ramirez strode into the makeshift holding area they'd set up, coming face to face with Fornax. The Suliban scientist glared at him with undisguised hatred. "Who are you?" Ramirez demanded. "What were you doing on that ship?" Fornax spat on the floor. "I'll tell you nothing, human filth." Hours of intense questioning followed, with Fornax stubbornly resisting all attempts at interrogation. It wasn't until Ramirez threatened to hand him over to Earth's intelligence agencies that the Suliban's perseverance finally cracked. "You primitive apes," Fornax snarled. "You have no idea what's coming for you. While your pathetic species sleeps, the might of the Suliban Empire will crush your world into dust." Ramirez felt a chill run down his spine. He raced to the communications array, hailing Earth Command on a priority channel. Static filled the speakers. "Sir," the communications officer reported, "something's jamming our signal. We can't get through." In the medical bay, Brian Gray's eyes snapped open. He bolted upright, ignoring the searing pain that lanced through his body. "The Suliban!" he gasped. "They're coming!" Dr. Kovac tried to restrain him. "Easy there, soldier. You've been through hell." But Brian wouldn't be calmed. "No, you don't understand," he insisted. "Earth is in danger. We have to warn them." Captain Ramirez entered the medical bay, his face grim. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," he said, filling Brian in on their communication problems and Fornax's revelations. Brian's mind raced, formulating a plan. "The Suliban cruiser," he said. "Its warp drive is still functional. We can use it to get back to Earth ahead of the invasion fleet." Ramirez nodded slowly. "It's risky as hell, but it might be our only shot." He turned to Lieutenant Jayla Hassan, who had been quietly observing. "Lieutenant, you're our best pilot next to me. I need you to go with him." Jayla straightened, dedication etched on her face. "Yes, sir." As Brian and Jayla prepared for their desperate mission, Ramirez addressed his crew. "We're taking Fornax into custody and making for the nearest Earth outpost. We need to rally every ship we can find. The fate of our species may well depend on it." The Odyssey's engines roared to life as Brian and Jayla boarded the battered Suliban cruiser. Ramirez watched them depart, a prayer on his lips. Two lone humans in a stolen alien ship, racing against time to save Earth from annihilation. The clock was ticking, and humanity's future hung in the balance.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.